Hello, and welcome back to the Time to Calibrate podcast. This is episode 14, and I am Brent Robillard, editor at the Calibrated Wrist. And I am joined as ever by my co-host, freelance writer, Marc Levesque. However, today we are a man down. Bob thought it far more important to be cavorting on the beaches of Cartegena than to join us on this chilly winter afternoon. But never fear, we booked a replacement, if replacing the irreplaceable is possible. Today we are joined by watch aficionado Ariel Adams. Ariel is best known as the founder of aBlogtoWatch, one of the most influential, most highly trafficked platforms dedicated to horology. Since its inception in 2007, aBlogtoWatch has become a leading source for watch reviews, collecting advice and buying guides, attracting a global audience and watch enthusiasts. But Ariel is also the host of Superlative Podcast and co-host of the aBlogtoWatch weekly podcast. He is an author, and most importantly, he is a husband and a father. You're a busy guy, Ariel. Thank you so much for making time for us here today. Before we stick you in the proverbial hot seat, why don't we ease our way in with a wrist check? What are you wearing today?
First of all, it's really nice to be here, and thank you for that lovely, warm introduction. That was really kind of you. That's nice. I don't usually get that type of introduction, so that's cool. I didn't know we were going to do the whole wrist check, as you call it, but I accidentally happened to be wearing the Aquamarine Dream that I designed with Zodiac. And I have a question for you guys. Before this, there really weren't any aquamarine watches that were popular. All of a sudden, this crazy Tudor came out with one today. I'm crazy, but did I sort of start the modern trend of aquamarine men's watches?
I think it's fair to say that between the three of us, yes. The answer is yes. Okay. You have started the trend.
And is it aquamarine, that Tudor, or is it a slight play on a Tiffany?
I mean, but the Tiffany is a slight play on aquamarine.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you're right. It's not exactly one color, but this has several shades of aquamarine on it. That was the whole point.
Yeah. I remember when you started that watch. That was a really cool one. Good project.
Yeah. I'm just happy it's pretty and people like it. I did not think it would lead to major brands that would never do that, being like, oh, it's okay. I mean, look at the IWC. They have multiple versions of it, but that one, I mean, a while ago, they never would have considered those colors. It's interesting how, again, it's just a color, but they need that type of validation. They're like, oh, the nerds like it? Great, we'll do it too.
We're calling a nerd. I mean, we resemble that remark.
I didn't realize people think that's a derogatory term. I've always been endeared by that. Should I have been way more insulted in my life?
Brent and I are probably a good decade older than you, and we remember when nerd was a derogatory term. Probably still
I remember the movie, the Nerds movie. That was filmed at the University of Arizona where I went.
Wow.
As ironically, but that was my first thing with nerds, was those movies, of which there were many, and those guys, they got girls.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. In the end,
yeah. Well, Hollywood only tells the truth, right?
Sorry, you were doing the wrist check. I totally took it over. I'm so sorry.
No, that's fine.
No problem. That's a great piece, by the way, Ariel. Marc, what have you got on today?
I've got my Marathon SAR with a white dial, quartz edition. Loving this thing very much. It's so convenient. It was nice and ticking properly and telling the right time on my desk. Hadn't worn in a couple of days, and cool, perfect on the wrist. What about you, Brent?
That's fantastic. You're definitely repping Canada there for us today.
Yeah.
I actually have on that new Nevada Gretchen that I picked up, and it's quite a mouthful. It's the Chronomaster Aviator Sea Diver Interbezel. So yeah, that's what I have on today. I'm really enjoying it. It's got the world time bezel on right now, but there's 4 others waiting in a drawer just for me to become bored, I suppose.
Those pop off by just prying?
They do, actually. They're quite simple to take off, but yet they feel quite solid as well. My fear is not about banging them or having them pop off, but what I wonder is, in terms of longevity, if you change them more and more often, are they going to wear out those 4 bearings that are there? I don't know. Only time will tell, but I'll tell you, the first few days that I had it, I couldn't stop popping off the bezel and putting a different one on just to say that I did it. But,
yeah. I bet.
But lots of fun for a watch nerd. Yes.
All right. So let's start the questions here and then put Ariel on the hot seat. So if I remember correctly, Ariel, you live in California, probably, if I'm not mistaken, near the Los Angeles area. as our listeners
yep.
know.
In LA.
Yeah, right now Los Angeles is quite a bit on fire. I hope that you're safe and that your loved ones are safe. How are things there right now? Are you out of the danger?
It's pretty wild over here. We had been warned for a number of years about how there was going to be more fires and how this was very dangerous, and a lot of the people who lived in those areas knew about it. Still horrible tragedy, an explicitly insane loss of value. So many people displaced. I have family members who still are not allowed to go back to their homes, and I know people whose homes have been burned to the ground. Everyone I know here in Los Angeles has someone who this is touched. It's that big of a deal, even though it's only certain areas. But it's a shocking thing. It will leave a scar on Los Angeles, but as is the case with these things, we will rebuild and we'll be stronger. I mentioned this to a few people. I'm actually quite inspired by many elements of Japan's culture on this topic, because they're set up with the idea that cities are going to be destroyed by some natural disaster, whether it's earthquake, tsunami, fire, volcano. So they sort of built into their culture this idea that cities are going to need to be rebuilt from time to time. And that's somewhat reassuring, because I think it's sort of Western civilization, we're like, these cities are here forever. And it's like, no, cities come and go. It's the culture, it's the people, it's the resilience which matters. And if anything, I'm wanting there to be more fandom in our little hobby for firefighters. We're like obsessed with like watches for soldiers and watches for divers and drivers and all this stuff. Firefighters have a very technical job. They fight, and they also fight a very non-controversial enemy. The difficulty, like in World War II watches and stuff like that, is like there was always a human on the other side. But like everyone can agree, like fire is a great enemy. So I, in a weird way, for our hobby, hope that there's a somewhat of an interest in making watches for firefighters that are honor firefighters or something like that. Like this is for me the next hero category that our little industry needs to focus on.
I do wonder if we'll see something from William Wood after
exactly.
After this
William
is
Wood
all
comes to
said
mind.
and done. Actually,
yeah, they're definitely the only one. I mean, but again, to have it be a whole category, you can't just have one brand. I think there needs to be multiple brands who maybe are not just dedicated to it, but like why an IWC can't come out with a flame-resistant watch? I don't know.
Yeah, it's food for thought. Yeah, for sure.
I think it was Jason Heaton, actually, from the great NATO, and also a renowned watch writer who posted not too long ago on Instagram that the heroes don't only wear capes. And it was an image of a firefighter actually in LA, and I think it received really, really, really positive feedback. So
yeah. Jason's been on my show before, and I've known him for a lot of years and stuff like that. I mean, he's definitely the right type of person to point that stuff out. But it requires this critical momentum. I say it, you guys say it, he says it. I think the interesting issue is that the watch industry tends to most comfortably focus on stuff they've done before. So historically speaking, there have been watches for soldiers. There's been watches for pilots. As far as I know, there haven't been a lot of specific watches for firefighters. And I think that's the trouble they have. They don't have history to lean back on. They actually have to invent something new. So making it classy, making it cool, making it affordable, making it work, it's actually technically quite complicated. I think it's a challenge that we want brands to take, because the outcome could be quite satisfying. And if anything, the interest or the focus on firefighters is going to go up over the next few years, not go down.
Yeah, maybe you should take a page in your own book and do a turquoise firefighter watch, aBlogtoWatch collaboration, get the ball rolling, and then all the other brands are going to do it.
I have a lot of creative projects going on at any given time, and I'm really happy about that. A lot of it depends on finding someone who's willing to do it.
Yeah.
And when it comes to fire resistance, it's a technical challenge. The easiest place was the strap, and there's been a couple of things out there, but even that is challenging. But you look at how long it took for them to achieve water resistance. This is several decades. I mean, really, this is a course of a lifetime, and that was a difficult thing to do. Fire resistance is similar, where you have to shield the internal from something very harsh outside. Think about how a watch case can survive high heat. How can it not cook the inside? How can it not smoke up the crystal so that you can see through it? Because I think that's what a flame-resistant watch would need to be, one that could be worn on the outside of a firefighter outfit and put up with not just scratches and things like that, but like actual high burning temperatures, like being in an oven. And for that to be a serious product, companies need to invest in it. But I think what's interesting is like people always say like, yeah, but the G-Shock can do that. Well, the G-Shock can't do that. As far as I know, that thing, that thing will melt. And so it's actually a new frontier. And everyone who's like a business guy at a brand is like, oh, investment, I don't want to do that. But that's what inspires us. It's these purpose-built tools. So yeah, it's going to be expensive to develop it, but we're going to buy it because it's awesome.
Yeah, that's cool.
I can actually really see a guy like Andrew McLean in Seal Watches picking up the torch, metaphorically and literally speaking here, actually.
Yeah. So I think you guys can see the vision of how it would be cool, but also appreciate the very real research and development challenge that is going to be more than, a couple of hobbyists in their garage buying parts online and putting the thing together. Like, I have no idea, technically speaking, how to do that. Now, the technology exists out there. You have in aerospace, for example, in space, materials are designed to operate extremely high temperatures. So we have this stuff out there, but again, it's going to be the right merger of creative vision, engineering, taking from one industry and pulling over to another, to make it happen. And, the watch industry does it in various good and bad ways. I think about all the like exotic car and boat parts that they've just stuck into watches, like, oh, this is used on racing yachts and now it's in a watch. I don't know if that really helps a lot, but at least the industry is used to taking from other industries and trying to find a way to make it work.
Yeah. If there's a brand, like you said, that would over-engineer a watch to do that, Seal Instruments comes to mind for sure.
Yeah. Those they're in Canada. That's why I keep plugging them, right?
No, they're in Arizona.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I say that because Matt Smith Johnson, who's in Toronto, did a collaboration with them a couple of years ago, and I just assumed because he's in Canada.
He's Canadian. I mean, he was born or he lived in Canada for a while, but he's in Arizona.
Oh,
has
okay.
a shop
There's a Canadian
Tucson.
connection there. I know.
Yeah,
it.
for sure.
Yeah.
Many good things come from here, right?
I agree.
So, Ariel, you and I have known each other for a long time. I think we started talking about writing on aBlogtoRead way back in the day. And unfortunately, timing wasn't very good for me, and you never stopped. It was quite the ride. And you did change the name to aBlogtoWatch. And I was wondering how that affected the traffic, the branding, why you did it. I know that Brent at the Calibrated Wrist recently changed from Calibre 321 to the Calibrated Wrist. And there was some issues with, difficulties with traffic and links and URLs and so forth. Can you tell us all about that? Like what happened there and why? And
yeah, I mean, I think it's important to recognize that this happened quite a long time ago. So circumstances have changed. This was back in 2009. So 2007, Start a Blog to Read was not immediately aware that it was going to turn into a watch discussion only publication or my full-time job, right? It was sort of a hobby. I wanted to explore writing and things like that. I quickly realized I just wanted to write about watches. Pretty early on, I had registered the domain aBlogtoWatch because I had realized aBlogtoRead is a bit too generic for the topic. Literally, I was like, what's a silly name for a blog? Oh, aBlogtoRead, right? Like, it's just a very, like, spontaneous kind of idea. Changing it over happened, I think, in 2009. I think it was, I had to make a decision then because it was at the point where if I didn't do it then, it'd be too difficult down the line. It's easier with a newer website to change the links because there aren't as many backlinks and things like that. But yeah, people don't really understand that, when you have a website, it's similar to a structure. And if you move something, you have to like change all the utilities and addresses and things like that. Like it's very, very complicated. I've relied on a lot of intelligent programmers and website professionals to help with these things. I was living in San Francisco at the time, and I think that I had a resource then that I don't have now, which was a bunch of people around me, even in my social circle, who had very sophisticated skills with programming and web design and things like that, who I could go to. A lot of that type of help no longer exists, especially for free. It is much more challenging these days to operate your own website. A lot of that's why places like Instagram and stuff and YouTube get so popular, because it's like you can have your own space without having to manage your own website. But I think ultimately it's better to have your own website. You get to control it more. You don't have to suffer through an algorithm. But you're right. You're responsible for all the little nitty gritty here. So ultimately, what's right for the website. These changes can happen. They can, they can you can do them. There's a right way. People change website names all the time, but you have to go through a lot of steps, and you have to consult with a professional. And it takes a few months sometimes for the internet to figure it out. But again, the help is out there. Remember, no matter what your internet task is, someone out there has done it before you.
Yeah, it probably has a couple of YouTube videos.
Yeah.
So yeah, going back, I moved into the house I live in now in 2007. Now, prior to moving here, I lived in a small little suburb place, 5,000 square foot lot, cookie cutter stuff. And when I moved to where I am now, it's a forested area. I have about 2/3 of an acre. So my chores, my outdoor yard work has quadrupled or had quadrupled. And so I started listening to podcasts at the same time as I was either mowing the lawn or raking the leaves or whatever else we were doing outside. And I had found a podcast. It was probably I think it was the only watch podcast out there, was the one that you were hosting with John Biggs back in the day. And I enjoyed listening to it. And half the time it was John going off the rails and you trying to get him back onto the rails. So that was a long time ago. Whatever happened to you two? You guys still communicate? Is he still participating at all on the aBlogtoWatch? And how do you feel about the early days of those watch podcasting days?
So John and I are still friends. We've known each other for a long time, and we got to know each other through watches. He was a pretty well-respected and popular tech journalist at the time, and I always learned a lot of things from him, and he's someone I admire a lot. It was my idea to do the Watch podcast. Didn't want to do it alone, and he had been doing some podcasting, so I could learn from him how to get into it. As you said, there was no Watch podcast at the time. He handled everything from, editing it and getting it up and distributing it, and there was not nearly the tools that existed right now. But what was fascinating is because there was such a smaller number of competing shows, we had basically all the attention, and it was a really great audience. He used the watch space as an escape from the tech space, where he couldn't joke around, he couldn't have as much fun, and he really liked to be silly, right? He thought it was a fun play space. Now, for watch collectors, this is a serious hobby, you can't joke around. But for John, it was the play space. So a lot of it was comedy, where we would make fun of goofy branding, we would make fun of weird designs, we would make fun of some of the Euroisms where things just don't translate very well to the United States. And it became really fun because there wasn't these types of more humorous conversations happening about watches anywhere, really, unless it was sort of a private group. John ultimately decided to take a lot of those episodes down. He was concerned that in sort of a new era of scrutiny, the fact that he was doing the accent of a French person would cast him in a shadow of being an immoral person. And he was, I think legitimately concerned, because there was a lot of people out there that were like, going back and listening to the podcasts. I don't think he ever said anything wrong, neither did I, but it was a more innocent time. It was an escape. It was truly for fun. There was never any type of trying to make money off of it. My business was a lot newer. I didn't have as many people. So I think it was a great entrance into it. And that was how I got started in podcasting. And I've taken breaks over the years, but I've gotten back into it. I think that I grew up listening to a lot of radio and radio shows, so it comes naturally to me to understand how to do this. And as you sort of said in the introduction where you were talking about me, I've really tried every kind of media, writing, hosting events, writing books, articles, videos. And I enjoy podcasting. I think I can bring something to it. When I interview people, they tend to like it and give and say, hey, you do this pretty well. So within the watch media space, yes, I like to explore around a lot, but I'm not trying to do everything. I'm trying to stick with the stuff that I'm best at. And I think what's fascinating is that the brands themselves for a long time, now they're getting into it, but they did not understand podcasts. They're like, but you can't see the watches, because all they think about is like advertising, design, beautiful, you want, right? They didn't understand that this culture of talking about it, laughing about it, comparing about it, disagreeing about it, is a huge part of it. And An interesting statement I've heard from multiple people recently, and I want to know your guys' opinion on it, is that if it wasn't for the friendships and the social element, they might actually drop the hobby. Now, I didn't start watches as a social thing, and I don't know that I would personally fall into that category, but what do you think about the idea that there's a lot of watch lovers out there right now that if it wasn't for the ability to have or keep friends as a result of it, they might drop the hobby altogether?
You're 100% correct.
Absolutely. I think that it's the staying power that comes from the friendships. I mean, you can get into a hobby and you can be hardcore at it for a year or two, and then, it slides away and you move on to something else. But I think you find with a lot of watch enthusiasts that they've been there for a long time, or even if they're beginning, they will be in that for a long time. And it has a lot to do with exactly what we're doing right now, sitting around and chatting about watches. We've mentioned the Toronto Time Show, timepiece show here a number of times on our podcast, because for us, it's been a boon to the watch industry, to the watch enthusiast sphere here in Canada. And a lot of that was not just the brands that were presenting there and the opportunity to handle the watches, but to meet people that you had been building friendships with for literally years on social media. And that just strengthened, I think, a lot of the ties that we have here in the watch enthusiast sphere in Canada. So absolutely.
Yeah, I agree.
The relationships are key.
I started collecting watches in the early 90s. And when the internet came around, with Time Zone and WatchNet, I developed friendships there. I was moderating on Watch You Seek. I wrote for a magazine. It was all over the place, but it was the friendships that I built off of that turned into Instagram now. And now with the podcast, Brent and Bob, our other co-host, the three of us had never met in person. We were friends on Instagram for years, chatting here and there. And then I had the idea for the podcast, and we talked and we jumped on board, and we met for the first time in person at the Toronto Timepiece Show. And we've been great friends ever since. And like Brent said, that rejuvenated not our interest in watches. I think we've always had an interest in watches, but it just rejuvenated the whole hobby for us. And we're all looking forward to going to Vancouver this spring and again this fall at the Toronto Timepiece Show. It's quite the fun. Yeah, Ariel, we'd love to have you come down and visit. I think you'd like it too.
I'd be honored to join you guys.
So, yeah, you mentioned at the beginning, as far as the brands taking notice of your work and of bloggers, and them not quite respecting or not quite giving you the time of day, especially when you used to go to Basil World and those other places where they'd, shun over the print media people, and then the bloggers would be last at the bottom feeders to get any time with anyone. Now that times have changed and now everybody wants a piece of Ariel, what do you think was a tipping point? When and what was a tipping point in the industry when they realized that, maybe we should participate, or maybe we should get Ariel to come over and talk to us?
Yeah, there's a lot of sort of questions compounded in there. I'm trying to figure out what direction to take there, because I do remember those years of going to Basel World without invitations to meet with brands and having to elbow my way in. I was just emailing with someone who I hadn't seen since the Basel World days. It's probably been 12 years or so since I saw her. And, I do remember how I had to sort of just wiggle my way in there. You'd have to go up to a booth and say, I want to talk to somebody. And they'd sort of look you up and down and decide who to talk to and if they should even respond. I think a lot of it was my own ignorance and not knowing what they were thinking. Because for me, I was like, people want to hear about this. I have access. I can share things with people. Like, you want this. I believe so firmly in what I was doing and the value to them that I never thought very often about how they were thinking about it. If they would even want this media. The whole idea that they were like, that they could be afraid of a watch review, which is a very real thing, never occurred to me. We've seen brands who have made policy decisions are like, we don't want people sharing their opinion about us, which to me sounds crazy. To you, it might sound crazy, but this is a very real mentality that we're battling against. So I think the context is an industry that does probably not understand media as well as they should, and also has a lot of animosity towards it because they make emotional decisions and they don't necessarily subscribe to the notion that like all news is good news. Like, like all coverage is good coverage. For them, if you're not saying glowing things about it, they don't want you to say anything at all. And so they still come from this area of a bit of ignorance and prejudice towards the notion of sort of having an open conversation. And I say to them, for every person out there that doesn't like you, there's someone that does. But it's the person who doesn't like you who's going to say something. The person that does is going to be a little bit more quiet about it. So what I had to develop is, in addition to being a watch blogger, so to say, I had to be this weird, like, diplomat representing what they called new media or internet media. And I had to sort of understand traditional publishing in reverse, because most of the people that were the fellow writers, they had come from a traditional print background, and they were sort of being forced to contend with digital, where I was what they called the digital native, and I sort of understood it. So I had a lot of value to bring because I was helping to usher people into an era that they were truly unfamiliar with. And also, I was never trying to sell things to them. I have a legal background, and that gives me, I think, what you might call a consultative approach, where I always feel very strongly that if I give them advice and I'm going to be audited as like, with that good advice, I have to defend myself. So I've always been assertive with what I feel, but also tried to be as professional and sophisticated as possible in explaining my position. I've had to adapt my approach with watch brands constantly. That's something I think is important. I do not have the same way of speaking to them when I was 25 years old as I do now into my 40s. I have had to develop as a professional to learn how to work with their interests, how to represent, our community interests, how to represent retailer interests. I think that's what's kept me in it, is that I do so much more than just write about watches. I wish I could just sort of focus on shooting watches, because that's what I love. I love being behind the camera, shooting a watch, getting to know it, and sharing with the community. That's my favorite thing to do. But that's like maybe 20% or less of my time now. I have to spend a lot of time, not just running a business, but acting as a liaison between these various arms of the industry that all need each other, but all have a fight. I mean, retailers and brands fight, media and brands fight, brands and customers fight. Like, there's not a lot of cooperation. It's a lot of parties fighting who all love watches, but can't seem to agree on too much else.
Wow. And the scary part is between 99 and 2005, I was the watch reviews editor for Instinct magazine, so a print publication. And
Yeah,
I had my media accreditations. And so I was getting the invites by mail. Here are the available times for meetings with this brand or that brand. Here's the invitation to the black tie party with Roger Federer and Miss Universe. Here's, like, I was getting all that stuff in the mail. And meanwhile, you were struggling just to get your foot in the door. And I never went. I never took the opportunity to go, which is silly, to be honest. But I had a full-time career other than that, so I had no choice but to stay home.
That era was great to be in media. I think it's challenging right now. I mean, the problem is the luxury industry relies on there being a large celebratory environment around the world of people spending on themselves and having fun. Right now, we live in more depressing time. People have less to celebrate, a little bit more worried about the future. And so the luxury industry now doesn't have this environment around it that it needs for this sort of growth. It has to basically not to show up to the party, it has to create the party. It has to create the reason to celebrate. And they did it really well for a while. And I think that's what they need to rediscover again, because those important events, that excitement, that thing where you from afar, from countries away said, wow, I'd really like to go to that needs to come back. A lot of the trips and things like that now are cut back in a lot of ways in terms of their investment. They're not organized as well. Everything is what I call an Instagram event, where it's like it's there for the photography, but no one there is really having a good time. So my hope is that it'll actually return back to that, where they recognize that they can't just sell to the lifestyle, they have to actually represent the lifestyle.
Yeah, agreed.
I'd like to turn away from industry just for a second, although we're certainly circle back to that. And let's talk a little bit about watches, that 20% of your time that you get to spend. In a YouTube piece, and this would be quite a few years ago now, it was by Crown and Caliber. You had said that if you are wearing a boring watch today, you are really doing yourself a disservice. Can you elaborate on this a little bit?
Yeah, I remember the interview. I have to remember the context within I said that. It's sort of like life's too short to have ugly days. You should always surround yourself with beauty. And the idea is if you go out to actually select a watch and put money into it, and it doesn't make you happy, or it doesn't like remind you of a positive feeling, or at least say something interesting about who you are, it's kind of a waste. And I think that actually can happen with a Rolex sometimes. Perfectly good watch in most respects, but it's become so generic. Many times nobody has any personal experience with it other than I was told this is expensive and makes people think I'm successful. And it's so generic that multiple people in any given room could be wearing the same watch. It doesn't really say anything unique about you. So I think what I was trying to say is if you're going to go to the trouble of selecting, buying, and wearing a high-end timepiece, it should not be boring because you sort of wasted the whole reason you're investing in that. I think that's what I was trying to say.
Fantastic.
Hallelujah.
Yeah, you wrote G-Shock, a book that celebrates that cultural icon in horology, and then more recently you wrote The World's Most Expensive Watches. Now, if you can enjoy and celebrate both ends of that watch spectrum, what would you say makes a good watch or an interesting watch?
I mean, I have this larger idea of honestly coming up with a museum to answer this exact question. It's sort of like saying what makes for interesting art, and you're like, well, what rabbit hole do I go down? It really comes down to the fact that watches can have so many interesting things inside of them. And that's what's so great about this hobby, is that people who are interested in totally different things can all coalesce around this little object, right? Like you can be a tool nerd or someone who's obsessed with what celebrities do, completely different types of hobbies, yet focus on the same product, right? So there's a lot of different vectors, if you will, to appreciating timepieces. And of course, you can enjoy multiple elements to it. So that's the one thing, is that, if you are really into the watch that your hero wore versus a watch that someone spent thousands of hours of their own time inventing and creating, there's a lot of ways to use this hobby to get a positive feeling. Of course, everyone is going to be limited by their budget. The vast majority of watch enthusiasts will have watches they can buy and watches they can only dream about. But without the watches that we can dream about, often we don't get excited about buying watches. And it's sort of the same way with cars, right? Car people love a lot of cars that they'll never own. They end up buying more practical things, but it's that dream of those sort of more elaborate things. I will say that the good news is that many of the wealthy people I know that can afford those expensive watches do really cherish them. And that's something nice, that those ultra luxury timepieces very often get in the hands of people that know exactly what they're buying, can appreciate it, ideally can afford to repair them when they inevitably break. I grew up in this era where in cartoons and movies, like in the 1980s, like watches were everywhere, from like in a science fiction movie, some watch that did something crazy, to like Inspector Gadget and all this stuff. There was just, I didn't really notice it, but sometimes I would rewatch those shows and movies from the 80s. It was like, watches were everywhere. I remember the movie They Live that I like to talk about with my buddies all the time. Like, no one seems to remember that there's a Rolex present in there, which is also a teleportation device, right? And there's all these interesting instances of watches being in movies as part of the plot. It was like the guy's gadget. And so for me, it was just always obvious to take this fascination I had with tools, which many men do, and apply it to the watch. I started wearing watch from a very early age. It was the utility and what you could put into this device which really fascinated me. I didn't really become a watch collector until my 20s, when I realized that there was this larger world out there. And I really didn't understand at the time what was so captivating about it, especially since I had no other friends that were interested in the hobby. And I think all of us who are watch lovers have this moment where we're really excited about something, and someone else that we know and respect and who maybe understands us, like, just doesn't get it. We're like, why don't you understand why this is cool? And it's sort of like a disease they haven't acquired yet, right? Like, you got to get you got to get this virus, man. So again, I know it's a long answer, but I can appreciate the G-Shock because of the time and effort that went into it, as much as I can appreciate the one of a kind Bejeweled watch for the time and effort that went into it. Different types of time and effort, but as long as you can appreciate that time and effort and what the team of humans was thinking, then I think you can really mentally get excited about whatever it is you're wearing.
That's a wonderful response. As your book writing proclivities suggest, you also own all ends of the watch spectrum in your own collection. That same Crown and Caliber piece that I was quoting from earlier had you choose a small handful of timepieces that you called members of your permanent collection. And one that really interested me was that Seiko C1535007, which also came from a 1980s movie, Back to the Future, and was worn by Christopher Lloyd in that film. In such a varied collection, what are some others that stand out for you or perhaps mean more to you than the rest?
The wonderful thing about watches and meaning is that most of the most important meanings are personal ones. I received it from this person or at this time in my life. And that's one of the reasons I actually don't ask a lot of my guests about their watches, because I understand that my relationship with that watch cannot be transferred to you. Like, even if I give you that watch, you don't have that same experience. So I sort of try to advocate for people to like go out and have your own experience with watches. And so the watches I have that have the most meaning to me are because I acquired them from people in a relationship that was quite unique to me. But I find that over time, if I had a really sentimental, ugly watch, I won't wear it, right? But if I have a watch which is pretty and I have like no real relationship with it, I will wear it. So I have a lot of sentimental watches where I just sort of store away and I'll never wear. But that's not what I get excited about showing off. It's I don't need to wear the personal watches. I own them because they're sentiment of my life. But it's the tool watches, it's the design watches. That's what I like to wear. And I think that that's what distinguishes me as a collector is I don't care if I have a positive memory all the time. I have those watches, I wear them once in a while. Even if I just look at them, I have that memory. But that's not the ones that I wear. What I wear are the ones who have stories that can translate to you guys or anyone else. And I think that's really important because I think a lot of collectors are like, my dad gave me this, so all of you should love it.
Look, I have a Festina I purchased in 1998 on my honeymoon in Santorini, Greece. I don't wear it at all, but I love it to death. Yeah.
Yeah, it means something to you, but like you give that to someone else, so like, I didn't go to Santorini. I don't know.
I do actually divide my collection into sort of two broad categories. And one is the ones that I really love to wear. And the other are, I literally call the sentimentalists. And those are the ones that came from my wife at a certain era, or my son purchased for Christmas one time or whatever, or something that was passed on from my father. And I know that I'll never get rid of those because those are the ones that mean the most. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're the ones I wear the most, obviously. So yeah, I totally agree. As someone who participates heavily in, and some might even say drives social media to some extent, you've also warned about the dangers of those faces in the watch collecting sphere. What is the dark side of social media to you in watch collecting?
You know, I've recommended to people that they spend several years developing as a collector prior to ever engaging in a conversation with other collectors online, with, on Instagram or somewhere else. I think the danger is in forgetting why you're in the hobby to begin with. I know that it's a social hobby and I want people to make friends, but you're kind of a poser if you do it just for the social element. Like, please like watches first and then find other people to nerd out. Again, I'm using the term again. I know not everyone likes that, nerd out with. Because you need to be confident in what you like, and you need to be secure, and you need to enjoy the hobby in a vacuum. I really think that anyone ideally should be able to just enjoy their watches, even if they never get to talk about them with anyone. The problem and the danger is one of being inadvertently influenced. And I've written about this extensively in specific articles. I mean, I love talking about the psychology of collecting, but what I notice is a population of people who are very readily influenced. The easiest to digest content about watches is, hey, here's 10 watches I think you should own, 5 watches you don't want to miss, like a bunch of nonsense lists like that again are very easy to digest by someone who's new. I think when you take this hobby seriously, you understand you are being foolish to come up with such lists. They're so arbitrary, yet the general consumer likes these types of lists. It's a way to start. And the problem is if you just buy these watches from these lists, you don't know why you're getting them. You think that you're going to go out there and some guy's going to give you a thumbs up. He's like, oh, you bought the watch from the list. That's awesome. No one's going to notice it. And so I think the real worry is you think that this is the way to enter the hobby. You believe this is going to give you, we'll call it happiness or social success. And then it doesn't. And then you get discouraged and you leave the hobby. So for me, the real risk is in someone not enjoying the watch hobby in a way that allows them to enjoy it for a long time. Because I want there to be as many fellow watch collectors as possible. I don't want to feel as alone out there, right? But for you to become a collector for years, if not decades, you can't spend money on watches that make you unhappy. This hobby has to deliver happiness. And if you buy watches that someone else told you to buy for more money than you wanted to spend, and it doesn't make you happy, and no one notices it, you're like, I'm going to go get a motorcycle, right? So I think that's really the risk, is this hobby has to offer returns. And when I make advice like be careful online, it is in order for someone to have a positive return. I want to warn people about things that they may not know they're walking into, but since I sort of see this from a bird's eye view and I have to constantly examine the psychology, I see things that can make people frustrated, angry. I look at more negative comments than I do positive ones. I know what frustrates people. I know what annoys them. And so as best as I can, I try to give people well-meaning advice to avoid things that lead to a negative outcome versus a hobby, which, again, is satisfying. This is a distraction. This is leisure. People spend money on their hobby. Very few people make money on their hobby. If you do, it's called your job. So I want this to be a good hobby for as many people as possible. The brands don't care about that. They just want you to buy stuff. They are not really thinking about this being enjoyable for everyone. They're very, very narrow in their focus. And that is, are you going to give me your money? You're going to give me your money, right? Maybe next week you'll give me your money? That's really all they're thinking about. And that's not enough for this to be a successful leisure pursuit for people. That's where I think the media comes in.
You have mentioned in that last answer both money and advice. And so you are noted as having said, friends don't let friends buy above retail. And you also went through a long period, I note, on Instagram where you weren't posting things like Rolexes. I see that now you've kind of returned to doing that, but were those two things related?
Well, I got bored of Rolex. I just got really, really bored. I mean, I have some Rolex watches. I haven't worn them in years. No, I love the brand Rolex. I gone to events. I highly respect the people there. I'm fascinated by the company, and they make watches in a way that no one else does. But as a collector, I had no interest in wearing them because there was this connotation of, do you know how much this is worth? It didn't say anything about me. It was just sort of like a trophy, be like, I got a dealer to do something for me. So I stopped posting about it. First of all, because everyone else was, and I'm the type of person that says, like, if everyone's going this direction, I'm going to go this less crowded direction, right? That's just how I am always. I don't like standing in lines. I don't like trying to compete for things. So if everyone's into Rolex and I'm finding them boring, I'm like, there's other watches out there. And that's something I try to say to people when there's these rallies around a particular watch. It's like, got to have that one. The dumbest thing to do is be like, I'll buy that too, because you're already losing as a collector because you're not getting something cool and unique. So if people are standing in line for a watch, my recommendation is run the other direction. I also think that the idea of a watch as an investment, like a financial investment that someone like buys from you at a profit later, is a dangerous, misguided concept. Yes, it's an emotional investment. It's an investment in yourself. But the idea that you're going to make money off of it later is a bad idea. And the only situation that makes sense for anyone to spend more money than retail on the watch is if you're going to be making money off it, which is extremely rare, or if like you just got to have it so badly. But the reality is, and you guys I'm sure will agree, there are so many amazing watches out there that would love a home on a wrist at a price at retail or below, that financially it's just dumb and foolish to ever spend more on retail. It's like, imagine there's two restaurants. One's really busy and one's empty. And the one that's really busy is like, I'll give you a table now, but you have to spend another $100. And the restaurant next door is like, what are you doing? I have a table for you right now. Like, why are you spending more? That's the way I think about it, because there isn't just one watch that will make you happy. There's many watches that will make you happy. There is no excusable reason I can really think of to ever have to spend more than retail or even be on a waiting list. There are so many good watches out there, and that's really what I'm trying to get across.
I agree with you 1,000%.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Absolutely. You know, there's we were just talking about social media. There's a herd mentality that can sometimes be generated out of social media, and I think that that's what also pushes people towards paying more than retail, or to lining up, as you say, for a watch or putting their name on a waiting list. It isn't necessarily, although I'm not saying that it can't be, it isn't necessarily a personal decision. It is one more that they are driven to do by some kind of popularity contest, maybe. I want to talk to you about something you said in a 2022 Watch Pro interview. And it's kind of a selfish question for me because I am also the editor of a fledgling online magazine. And what you said is, quote, "Today, a lot of companies still believe in courting consumers directly and handling their marketing like a vertically integrated company. I see this as a losing proposition," end quote. And then, of course, you go on to mention how many watch sites went from blogs to retailers out of frustration with the marketing budgets they were or were not able to generate from brands. what does aBlogtoWatch or any other watch media outlet for that matter bring to the table that is vital to the industry, and why should brands or consumers take note?
That's a good question. And I think the first thing I'll say is remember how big most of these companies are. They tend to have just enough people to make the watches, handle what you'll call large sales accounts, meaning selling watches in bulk normally, service some of the logistical tasks, things like that. Yet they want to bite off more than they can chew. They want to be able to do everything from have stores to run vast marketing campaigns to investing in relationships one-on-one with VIPs. And they're correct that all these things are necessary. The problem is, again, their obsession with being able to control it seems to be overriding the practicality of you do not have enough human beings to do all this stuff. So a company makes a watch in Switzerland and somebody is in, I don't know, we'll say Vancouver, okay? Across the world, what makes more sense? The brand to have its own office and people in Vancouver and develop all those relationships, or say, you know what? That's a different city. That's a different culture. We hope they like our stuff. There's a retailer in town who is local, who understands the people, who can go to the weddings and the bar mitzvahs and the dinners and stuff like that, who can remember all the anniversaries and the names of children. Give them the opportunity to develop the relationship, sell the watches to them and let them profit. So it really comes down to simple business practicality. It's not that in theory brands can't do it. It's that I've never seen a brand that's actually set up to do it. And companies like Rolex and Patek Philippe, who arguably are in the best position, have said, no, we don't want to do that because we recognize that's very difficult. And Patek Philippe has an enormous amount of direct relationships with clients. That's how they have the position they have today, is because the Stern family is nice to their VIPs and treats them amazingly well. But Rolex...
Unless you don't like the Cubitus.
Well, yeah. It's a very complicated system of ongoing human dynamics that needs to be distributed and understood that culturally things are very, very different. There's so many places in North America, within Canada, the United States, that have people who think and talk and feel a certain way that someone in Switzerland is never going to understand or really come close to being able to gel with. So my perspective has always been use people who are local, share profits with them, let them develop the relationships, because it's simply not practical. All these companies think they're the size of Apple. Okay, they really think that they can do everything when they are mid-sized companies at best for the most part, usually small companies, that think very regionally and very insularly in a remote part of Switzerland often.
Let's move beyond watches for a minute then, because your personal story is bigger than just timepieces. You are a licensed attorney who turned his back on log, dove headlong into watches at the age of 25. Looking back, it's hard to argue that this wasn't a brilliant decision, but I can't imagine that too many people told you at the age of 25, this was a brilliant decision. So what career advice would you give to the millions of 25-year-olds out there, like my son and my daughter, about career moves?
As I interviewed many successful people, one of the things that became apparent very, very early on was how most of the success was both unpredicted and often random. No one went to school for that or said, that's what I want to do when I grow up when they were young. The success happened, accidentally. Yes, they prepared in a sense by being able to take advantage of those opportunities, but they wouldn't have been able to know how they got there. So I think that there's, in a sense, no right or wrong decisions because you really can't predict what the outcomes are going to be. But you need to try things. You can't simply wait for the world to give you an opportunity. The world doesn't do that anymore. You have to go out there and assert yourself. I relied on, I'll call it a blessing of sorts, more like a validation from my grandfather who died that same year. He died in 2009, which is the same year that I decided to go full time. And he was a successful business person who I admired. And I remember he was bedridden at this point, and I was in law school. I was a lawyer working a company and doing the website, basically all my extra time. And he saw that I was passionate about it. It was too late in his life to him really to focus on it. He liked watches, but you wouldn't call him someone who really talked about it in that way. And he was very difficult to make happy. He had a fractious relationship with my father, who died just a few years after that. They didn't get along. The reason I went to law school was essentially because of him. I wanted to be a filmmaker. And he's like, I work in that world. No one can make in that world. It's too hard. Go to law school. And I had I think 3 or 4 hours of being upset with him about it. And I was like, yeah, he's probably right. And I enjoyed law school. I loved it. So I really valued his advice. And I remember going to him and I said to him, look, I have this choice to make. There's been this, this is the 2009 financial crisis happened. I have to make the decision. I can either try to get a different legal job, or I can try on my own and take this watch blogging hobby and try to make a full-time living out of it. I understood at the time that it was a very risky endeavor, and I needed him to be the tiebreaker. And he basically surprised me because he'd never really spoken to me or anyone this way before. And he says, it sounds like you know what you're doing and that you really like this. I think you should try it. And that's all it took for me. And I know that sometimes people just look for signs, and that's sort of a silly kind of way of making a decision. But I allowed him to be the tiebreaker for me to decide what to do. And it was really nice to have that type of confidence. Now, sometimes that's artificial. Yes, I don't ultimately know what's going to happen. But I guess my suggestion for everyone is find someone whose advice or opinion you admire, run the scenario by them, and let them be a tiebreaker. Because sometimes we just need that sign, that direction. Sometimes people who are religious be like, I need a sign from Providence of which way to go, what to do. Sometimes we just need that. And so give yourself a way of articulating your options and ask someone who understands and who you admire to give you their opinion. They might see something you don't. Again, we have to take the risk. We got to throw the dice. We got to gamble. That's the only way to get anywhere in life. But sometimes we can deceive ourselves into thinking we know more than we do. So asking a buddy or a family member or a mentor, I think, is the best thing. You don't have to do what they say, but ask them. I think that's the best advice I can give.
Well, I'm glad I asked that question. That was excellent.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that question too.
That was excellent advice.
Thank you.
I might even heed that myself.
That was great. So, Ariel, as someone that's currently writing editorial and sponsored content for Warner Wound, I remember when aBlogtoWatch was first started dipping their toe in the sponsored content pool. And I remember seeing some of that nasty backlash in the comments. How did you handle it? And can you speak about the decision to provide that type of content on your blog?
So the first thing that I wanted to make sure with all advertising was that it was conspicuous. I think that what people don't want in marketing in any context, whether it's online or offline, is deception. People don't want to be lied to. People want to know, I'm looking at a piece of marketing material. I accept that. I understand that I'm in the market for goods and services all the time. I respect that someone's taken the time to try to convince me. So I've always recognized that people who read about a hobby or read editorial are also interested in learning about relevant goods and services. They just don't want to be lied to. And the luxury industry has for many years had a nasty practice of hiding advertising. This comes from cultural issues where it's seen as being, I don't know exactly the right way of saying it, but not the most proud thing in parts of France and Switzerland to advertise. But this is a very niche belief. This is completely insane in much of the rest of the Western world, especially the United States, where consumers expect, if a company wants my business, I expect for them to reach me multiple times and explain to me why. So I know that people who read about watches are interested in being romanced by brands. I fundamentally believe that advertising is both interesting and useful, but I also understand that people want it to be explicit and there could be no deception or anything like that. So that's really where we came from with sponsored content. Is storytelling is something these brands don't do well. We will lend our voice and write as though it is their words so that they can tell a story from them. And what I say to brands, and I think it's relevant, and I'm sure you'll agree, is that consumers both want to hear about a brand or product from the brand as well as the opinion of the community. It really takes both. to do that. So I knew that advertising is something that audiences want. I knew they didn't want to be lied to, and I knew that the brands were often quite ineffective of communicating the nuts and bolts of their stories. So that's really where it came from.
That's cool. Now, speaking of sponsored, Marc from Long Island Watches recently made a relatively large stink on Instagram about compensated reviews. I find it a little rich on his side because the reviews that he publishes are of the brands that he sells, which in turn leads to more sales and more profits. What's your take on the subject?
I've known him for a long time. The first thing is he'll say, I have kind of a wonky perspective on this. Like, he will admit that he's sometimes somewhat duplicitous on this, and also will say things to get a rise out of stuff. Like, he's not trying to be an academic. He comes from a biased position. He has a perspective, and he likes to lean into some of the quirkiness that has sort of developed around his personality. I respect the business he's done. He also represents, I'll call it an engineer mentality, which is, I want the best outcome for the lowest price. You can't have a watch industry for that. You can't sell a dream. You can't get people excited about designs or brands or history or anything like that by just trying to offer them the best tech specs for the lowest price. So his business is reliant on there being a larger watch hobby out there, and he's sort of created a nice little niche for himself. Yes, he reviews watches and also sells them, but it's because he, again, began all this as a watch enthusiast, and he likes having that outlet for it. I don't know the exact statement that he said, but I think that it's really comes down to the transparency. I hope that in his videos, he says, I'm reviewing it and sell it. And I think he's referring to a lot of content out there, which is, and this is how I refer to, influencers. I call them opinion mercenaries, where it's very obvious that their opinion is being purchased. And I think that's what upsets him, because if there's anything that Marc is not a liar. He's an honest guy, sometimes to a fault. And I think he doesn't like to see other people in his space so blatantly lying.
I think that's a good point, and I believe you're right. Yeah. So of all the pies you have fingers in, you write long-form media posts, you write for Forbes, you write for your own blog, meeting with brands, press trips, all that stuff. And I think you mentioned this before. What's your favorite aspect of what you do? Is it the photography and the hands-on reviews, or what's your favorite thing?
I definitely like getting up close and personal with watches and understanding them. The idea that I can spend time learning about an object, seeing how it's made, speaking to the people who designed it, wearing it, playing with it, capturing in detail. And part of the photography is also the magnification. We're doing macro photography, and as a result of that, I get to see the watch really, really close up, and I get to notice things that, honestly, the human eye can't without that type of magnification. So I guess it's really examining these products and investing intellectually in them, which is so gratifying for me. Sharing them is part of it, but it's more about sharing my passion for them, which I think is exciting for me. I guess I'm as comfortable speaking as I am writing. Thankfully, I'm a very fast and prolific writer, so it's not very much of a struggle for me. I know that others, it's more difficult for them to write. They write more slowly. That's definitely an issue on our team sometimes. But I really like the process of just examining a watch and then making some type of a record of it through photography. Again, it's almost an academic approach. I'm trying to create an archive of all these things, but also offering context about it. That's what I like.
Very good.
I want to end this afternoon kind of with a two-part question. I will tell you both parts in advance. Number one is, what's wrong with the watch industry today as you see it? And then the second part is, what excites you most about the watch industry today? So
I think what excites me the most about the watch industry today is the surprising level of resilience it's had. I consider myself reasonably observant, and I would not have been able to predict 10 years ago that watches would be as popular as they are today. Around the turn of the century, we probably all remember all this content about like, oh, babies born aren't going to know what watches are, and here's technology which is dying. And like, watches were given a pretty bad outlook. And I was kind of under the assumption that this was going to be an existing but niche hobby for the most of my time in it. And then through a variety of factors, watches were on everyone's mind, mainstream, whether it was for the wrong reasons, I don't think matters, but watches are more popular now than they were when I got started in this hobby. And I think that's what's most exciting for me, is that there's this whole generation of people out there who've been learning about, I don't know, expensive watches or exotic watches on social media as young people. And when they get older and maybe have some more disposable income, they will then start wanting to put that income in there. So I guess I am excited about, at least in the near and midterm, the longevity of this hobby. I do worry about the ability for the industry to produce enough watches in the coming decades. That's a whole other issue. I think the thing that worries me is something that people don't think about too often, is the death and rebirth cycle that exists. We like talking about these brands that have been around for 100, 150, sometimes 200 years. I know like Vacheron is having their 270th anniversary or some crazy thing like that. But the reality is that most of these companies did not operate continuously for this long. They had many periods of time where they died and then came back. How many times over the last 2 decades have we seen, guess what brand is coming back after years of being just a name and some designs on paper? So I think what worries me is that if there continues to be geopolitical, economic, and all kinds of other uncertainty and challenges out there, this industry will turtle up, as I say, and pull its head within the shell, and a lot of brands will go away into what I call hibernation, because, again, these brands don't really die. They're just waiting to be resurrected. And I see an economic case for that. I see a lot of economic signals that say there maybe doesn't need to be as many brands. Maybe they're producing too many watches. Maybe they got overeager. Maybe there's too much corporate interest and profit when really that profit needs to be reinvested in human resources, marketing, and research and development. So I think the industry has bit off a bit more than it can chew in terms of its expectations of profit. And because it won't be able to reach that profit, the industry will shrink. And a shrinking industry is not exciting for everyone in it until it's sort of hit a baseline and then begins to grow again. So I guess my worry is that we will be facing not an industry which is going away, but is shrinking in terms of the number of brands that can make a living selling watches. And that's going to be unpleasant, maybe expected. I don't think people are going to see it coming. Of course, we also have the situation where there's new brands or other brands being revived all the time. But I still see a period of some contraction, just given the fact that these brands, again, they get overeager. And you have to ask yourself, what makes more sense? Making more watches than you can sell and just destroying kind of your brand equity? Or some of these brands just saying, you know what, we're going to consolidate and wrap in our resource with another brand and just sell those watches. Maybe the industry doesn't need all these brands. And so that's what I suspect is going to probably happen in some way over the next 5 to 10 years.
There have been some other people actually on this podcast who have echoed that sentiment, that sort of boom and bust mentality. And some private conversations I've had with some other influential people have even mentioned brands they think are on that brink at this moment, not to mention those names myself, but certainly that seems like a strong possibility.
Well, look, when I started this years ago, when I started doing an analysis of the corporate interest in brands, it doesn't take a lot of effort to recognize that these corporate interests only have the brands so long as they can afford to profit from them. And that has to be measured against the embarrassment, so to say, of divesting or getting rid of an asset that is no longer making you money. And I remember, this was a long time ago, more than 10 years ago, I said, it's just a matter of time before a group like Richemont divests away from companies that it can't manage or are not profitable, not wrap them down, but get rid of them, sell them to another party or let them be free. And this was like a very scandalous thing to say. You couldn't suggest it to anyone at Richemont. If you wrote about it, it seemed like a big embarrassment for them. And now finally this year, they have publicly stated we're open to divestment for the right offer. So I knew it was coming. I talked about it when it was extremely taboo. And now the company itself, the organization itself has finally said, we're playing with the idea. So I believe confident in some of my outlooks because, again, I've talked about it, and now it's slowly, finally starting to happen. They all operate more slowly than I would ever operate, but these are the types of things I'm seeing, which lead me to believe that some of my predictions are probably going to come true more so than not.
Ariel, I wholeheartedly believe that we're going to have you back on the podcast again this year later, partially because I know that Bob would love to play a role the next time, but also because, believe me when I tell you that Marc and I have skipped a number of questions we had jotted down for today, simply because we're conscious of your time. We could definitely go on and on here. We find the conversation just scintillating, actually.
I'd be happy to come back.
That's wonderful.
Well, I appreciate that. Just before we go, though, I have one last thing I want to mention. One of my favorite things on aBlogtoWatch over the years has been the April Fool's gag posts.
Me too.
One of which, well, I think it was one of the first ones. It was the pet straps one.
A classic.
And I remember reading that and not realizing it was April 1st and wholeheartedly believing it in dismay. And I was like completely distraught. I made my wife read it and she says, "This is not real. It can't possibly be." So anyways, if you get a chance, Brent, put a link to that one in the show notes. It's hilarious and good on you for doing those.
I have a lot of fun with those each year. I always have more ideas than I can do, but yeah, I that's a whole other conversation. Because those are entire productions unto themselves, right? I don't just sit there and write those. Like those take teamwork and effort and stuff like that.
Oh, sure.
Anyways, thank you for that. Yeah.
Yeah. Ariel, thank you so much for your candor and your time today. Your thoughts on watches they're very studied. Even if they can be controversial, I find them always enlightening. So, have a great weekend and thanks so much.
Thank you, gentlemen. It was a pleasure.
Yeah. Thanks, Ariel. Really appreciate it.
Time to Calibrate is available everywhere you can find fine podcasts. Please like, subscribe, and hit all those bells and whistles. It does make a difference. Cheers.